Congressman, you've been in the middle of this now for more than a decade. For those constituents back home in Michigan, is it as bad as it is portrayed in the media, the dysfunction and the bitterness on Capitol Hill, or is it better than many people may perceive?
Well, that's a good question because I actually think it's better than people perceive. Because as much as what I've just described is a description of some of the dysfunction, it's the dysfunction, sort of the more exotic characters of Congress that get disproportionate attention because it's more entertaining. What's not particularly entertaining is that, like former Congressman Fred Upton, a Republican from Southwest Michigan, he and I became good friends, did legislation together, successfully addressed some really important issues, but you rarely see a headline in a newspaper that, airplane lands safely on runway. And what we're doing is, under all of this cacophony of noise, we're still getting some things done in a bipartisan fashion, but they're not the big things, and there's not enough of it. But it's still there. The spark that was lit by the framers still is there. We just need to find a way to give it more oxygen and not fall into the trap that we seem to have fallen into. So one big frustration is this, I think, misinterpretation of disagreement. The framers were brilliant, even if they didn't know it. They created a system that was intended to try to get every possible point of view under one dome and a process for argumentation of those different perspectives to produce policy. The way a lot of people view it now is that disagreement is dysfunction. What frustrates me is this all or nothing kind of approach to policy making that in many ways the public will encourage, that Congress reinforces, which causes more of that same encouragement coming from the interests and certainly just the public in general. This is a place where compromise is not just a way to get through problems. It is the very foundation of the institution. And now we treat compromise as if it's the last resort to not getting our own way, one side or the other, where it ought to be the starting point, not the rescue mechanism for a crisis.
Yeah, I guess two things. One, when I started the work on the Modernization Committee, someone gave me a speech from John Gardner, who had been a member of Lyndon Johnson's cabinet. And it was a graduation speech where he talked about declining faith in institutions. This was in 1968, by the way. So imagine, where we are in terms of faith in institutions now. But one of the things he talked about was institutional stewardship. And he said, organizations suffer from two problems. One, he said, organizations suffer from uncritical lovers who deny the sort of life-giving eye toward improvement that an institution needs to perform well. He said institutions also suffer from what he called unloving critics, people who treat an institution like the piñata at the party and have an eye toward demolition, which we see a lot in Congress. And he said what institutions need are loving critics. People actually want to see an institution improve, and come with the lens of actually caring about the institution. What's been great over the course of the years working on this modernization effort, with a whole lot of people in the building and with extraordinary folks outside of the building, of this sort of fixed Congress cohort that has been involved in this, is that there are so many loving critics. And I think there are actually more now than there were when I started the work on modernization. There are more people who are loving critics of the institution. And that gives me hope for the future. And the final thing I'll just say, I used to call myself a genetic optimist. And then someone gave me a quote from Rabbi Jonathan Sachs that said there is a difference between optimism and hope. He said, optimism is a passive virtue. It's the belief that things will get better. He said, hope is an active virtue. It's the belief that together we can make things better. He said it doesn't take courage to have optimism, but it does take courage to hope. And I like that. One, because it appreciates that we have agency, all of us, members of Congress, the people we represent, all have agency to make things better. And secondly, it uses the word we. It understands that we can't do it on our own, that it actually it requires us to work together, even with people who may think differently than we to do the hard work of making things better. So I leave this place with a sense of gratitude for being able to have been for a while in this institution, one of the loving critics of it, and with a sense of hope that both the people inside the institution and throughout our country are going to do the hard work of making things better.
So I guess the advice I would give my colleagues on both sides of the aisle is, if you're really here to make life better for the American people, then you need to be willing to work with the other side. That means you need to get to know people on the other side of the aisle. You need to walk across the aisle and talk with people. And you need to decide that you're going to be part of the solution and not just part of causing problems for your colleagues on the other side of the aisle, so that you can hope to send them home in the next election.
Let's talk about Congress as a whole, the committee process, the number of members, the 2-year cycle, the schedule, the calendar. If you could make changes to Congress as an institution, what would they be?
Well, great question. And we had wonderful committees for the modernization of Congress, and they did a great job of having different recommendations of how to make your work-life balance a little bit more balanced. And so I congratulate those folks who served on that committee, and I was able to testify in front of them. And I would say scheduling, predictability, so important. Knowing that we have a schedule, you do know when you're going to be able to go home, and sticking to it. But I find that I see now it's even more difficult for members. And now they have social media to contend with, and they will be followed if they're not in a certain event. So I think it's harder for members to do their jobs, even though technology has improved supposedly to make our jobs easier. I think that today's members of Congress have a far more challenging role than I did in my days, because of the presence of social media. And also, you can tailor your message to a certain audience, because if you're conservative, you go to Fox. If you're liberal, you go to MSNBC. And there's so many other outlets that were not around at that time when I first started. It was far more difficult for you to be able to get on TV, and far more important, because people would read newspapers. Now that's not the most popular way to get information. And to be on a Sunday show, a local show, that would be very important. It's not as important now, because you have different avenues available to you.
How difficult is it to buck the party leadership? Because you've worked under a number of Republican speakers, most notably Newt Gingrich, who in many ways changed Congress as an institution, also with Speaker Pelosi. But for Republican speakers, if you want to buck them in a vote, how difficult was that for you?
It can be difficult. And I tell you, Newt Gingrich really was such an important figure for the Republican Party, because he was the first leader who said, change your mentality. We are going to be in the majority. Don't think like a minority member anymore. We're going to take over. And Bob Michael, I served under him. He was our minority leader before Newt. And Newt became our speaker with a contract with America. Excuse me. But when you talk about bucking leadership, I was one of 3 Republicans who did not sign the contract with America. But we did it. Lincoln Diaz-Balart and Don Young were the other 2, because it would take away benefits for folks who are immigrants. And I had a very immigrant-rich community. But the way that I handled it, and it didn't become a problem for me, is that I told Newt, I can't sign it because of this provision. Don Young refused to sign it because he says, the only contract I have are with the people of Alaska. But Lincoln and I did not sign it. And that was the Bible of our Republican leadership. And but if you do it in a nice way, you can buck leadership. If they understand where you are and why you're voting that way, and your motivation, I think, even though difficult and uncomfortable, it's not a problem. They will not resent it. I never had any blowback from Newt Gingrich because I didn't sign the contract with America. And if you see his speaker portrait, it is of him holding the contract with America. And he revolutionized our party for the better. He was a dynamic leader, and we need those kind of leaders.
So based on that and based on what we observe both here in Washington and outsiders, is it as bad as it appears, or is it better than it's portrayed in the media?
So that's always the question that people ask. I think it depends on which part of that question you're asking. If it's, if the impression, if what appears to people is that we're at each other's throats every day, no, it's not like that. It's not as bad as that. There are relationships. There is a way to interact with your colleagues that makes sense, and I think it happens. Those aren't the floor statements or the hallway interviews that get picked up and broadcast across the country and the world, because again, boring interactions don't sell, so they're going to go for the red meat stuff, and so people are going to get that impression. If the question is it as bad as it appears in terms of the difficulty of getting kind of legislation over the finish line, that has gotten much tougher. And one thing I've observed is that back in the day, whenever it was you want to pinpoint as being a more functional institution, there were generally sort of frameworks that both sides subscribed to for how we were going to get things done. The budget, major legislative reauthorizations, and so forth. So you had a framework. You knew you were going to have some disagreements, but there was a basic framework for how you were going to do it. And then you might get sort of pushed up against the wall timing-wise, and there'd be some scrambling to get X, Y, and Z done, and so forth. But the scramble happened inside of a framework. And as a result, I don't think you dropped as many balls that you're juggling and other things. Mm-hmm. What's happened in recent years is the framework isn't there anymore to serve as kind of ballast in the ship of state, if you want to call it that.
Because you've never, not you personally, but in the 18 years you've been in Congress, not once was the budget passed on time.
Right. So, absent a framework, these scrambles that happen, this game of chicken that gets played right up until the end, which of course is the thing that some of the more extreme elements within the institution thrive on.
The performers.
What that means is the whole thing's a scramble. And the framework isn't there to kind of get you to the last stage inside of some sort of sensible approach. It all's getting thrown at the wall. It's very much a game of chicken or brinksmanship. And in an environment like that, a lot of things can get lost. You can wake up the next day and either something that was very important didn't find its way into the end of year bill, or something nobody wanted got tucked in the middle of the night because nobody was paying attention. So I think that that kind of structural ballast that used to operate isn't as available to us anymore. And so if people are making the observation from the outside, it seems like things have gotten really bad in terms of just getting stuff done. That, I think, is a fair observation. And I mean, we're down to like, we pretty much only can do the stuff that absolutely has to be done, and sometimes we don't get that done. But the idea that, this member, this Republican, and this Democrat, they work on a piece of legislation, and then they go get their co-sponsors, and it kind of moves along on a track, and it gets attention in the committee in a substantive way, and then it gets reported out to the floor, and then it, gets an opportunity for a vote. That's much, much tougher than it used to be.
you talk about the polarization in this town? How bad is it today?
It's the worst I've ever witnessed, and a lot of it has to do that with um, members not having a personal relationship with each other. They pick their sides, and they are dug in on their sides, even in state delegations. Uh, some members don't know each other's names, which I find extraordinary. I made it a point to to seek out those in my delegation and those who I served on the committee with, to find common ground. That we all have commonalities that we need to seek out, and that would help in today's environment here if they could just, establish a relationship, a working relationship, or even a friendship. I think it would make all the difference in this town.
So, what are your thoughts about the role of institutions and their importance or lack thereof in our politics?
Well, I think they are important. I mean, I think one of the problems we have, I think, in our country, and my personal view, is the lack of confidence in some of our foundational institutions that we have. Look, the House of Representatives has been unpopular since it was created. But the government as a whole hasn't probably been this unpopular in many, many years. I mean, it waxes and wanes, though. We go through periods where, obviously, the late 60s, for example, where, there were disagreements over the Vietnam War, or obviously the worst was the Civil War. But I think, we need to regain the confidence of the American people in fundamental institutions. The courts and the criminal justice system is taking it on the chin in the last, number of years. The Congress, the government, religious organizations, the police, public institutions like police departments and law enforcement. People have less confidence in the fairness in those organizations. I think in many cases, incorrectly, but nonetheless, it's there, right? And so, if we want to get back to foundational American values, we have to, all of us together, have to work to regain some of the confidence of these fundamental institutions. Otherwise, it's going to be hard to turn things around.
So, you worked with and served under 5 presidents and 6 speakers, including Tip O'Neill.
Correct.
How did you view the role of the speaker? And as a Democrat, how difficult was it for you to buck your own party?
Well, there's a variety of things there. Yes, I wasn't just a Democrat. I was a Democrat in a Republican seat. No, during that whole time, no Democrat ever carried it that ran for president, even Al Gore, and I succeeded Al. So I was always very sensitive, to what was going on. But the leadership, particularly Nancy Pelosi, recognized my situation, and they sort of knew that I would do the right thing if I had to at the end, But there really wasn't a lot of pressure in that regard.
One of the things as we talk to former members that comes up time and time again is the lack of civility that we're seeing in Congress today. As an outsider now looking at Congress as an institution and your experiences from 1985 through 2010, what are your thoughts? How is it today? What was it like when you were in?
Well, it was a different situation. When I was first elected, probably Tip O'Neill had a majority of well over 100. So it was do whatever you want to do because I got the votes here in terms of Democrats. But in those, 20 years before, quite frankly, the Democrats, my observation, Democrats were never mean to the Republicans. They just didn't take them seriously. They didn't have to. They had the votes. And so you could understand that there was a Republican resentment that boiled up. And Newt Gingrich was the face of that. And Newt felt like for Republicans to get a fair say in Congress, that they had to burn it down, which was unfortunate. It's unfortunate that they were put in that position, and unfortunate that he did that, because that really lit the fuse of whatever the opposition did to you, I'm going to do it to them when I'm in the majority, double. And so it had just ratcheted up since then. But in those days, there was no sleeping in your office. You know, by and large, people came, you know, in on a Monday and maybe left on a Sunday or their Tuesday afternoon, and they'd go home and work. And they found that they could spend more time with their families if the families was here, because then they could just work when they were in the district. And so you had, you know, people had, or members, kids were in school together, going to church together. The spouses were interacting a lot. So there was much more camaraderie in those early and mid 80s. And you just spent more time with each other in committee meetings and on the floor.
So if you want to get something through the House and send out a press release, yes, you can do it all day long on a partisan basis. If you want to make a difference, if you want to make change, if you want to enact laws, you've got to have a different strategy and think about the common denominator of the Senate and actually do things on a bipartisan basis. And so, you know, look, I think it's unfortunate because we're moving in a direction of perverse incentives of rewarding the people that are more bombastic or provocative, the people that also aren't getting anything done. And so, said another way, I think we're moving in a direction of incentivizing inaction.
We've had two speakers in this Congress. One of them was a good friend of yours, a mentor, I believe, Kevin McCarthy.
Both of them are. Yeah.
But when you went through the whole 15-round vote that was led in part by Matt Gaetz, what do you think that did for the institution and for your party?
Look, I think it was a huge embarrassment. And you know, you said that McCarthy was a friend of mine, and he is, and certainly has become a good friend. But when I engaged in January of 23 in the whole vote and deliberations and tried to negotiate a solution, Kevin McCarthy didn't ask me to do it. And I didn't do it because Kevin McCarthy was a friend. I did it because I'm sitting there watching on C-SPAN up close these incredibly embarrassing votes and negotiations that are going on. The cameras are right there on the House floor picking up all the conversations and obscene behavior. And it was embarrassing. I look at Congress as being the board of directors for America. I look at America as being the most exceptional country in the world. And to see that going down in the aftermath of an election where voters, you know, like it or not, they handed the reins, they handed the majority to the Republicans. And the fact that the Republicans couldn't even come together to elect a leader, I thought it was embarrassing. I thought it was unjust. And so I started working with groups of people trying to better understand where the conflicts were, where the problems were. And at the end of the day, I think that there were a lot of things that were done that were disingenuous, that were not true. I think a lot of the new members were misled, and so ultimately worked together and were able to get the votes that were needed to have a speaker elected and to allow us to move forward and actually address some of the priorities that America sent their representatives to Congress to actually address. And I think if the American people hand a party, and I don't like this, but I think it's the reality of today. If they hand a party the reins of government, if they hand the party a majority, I think it's the responsibility of those members to come together and elect a leader. And I think what Matt Gaetz and others did was incredibly, incredibly wrong.